So should we call the August 7th, 2023 City Council meeting to order? Ms. Thomas, would you please call the roll?
Councilor Payne,
Here.
Councilor Pinkston,
Here.
Councilor Puryear,
Here.
Mayor Snook,
Here?
Vice Mayor Wade.
Here.
All right, is there a motion to approve or to amend the agenda?
I move for approval of the agenda.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed say no. Okay, the motion passes to adopt the meeting agenda. This time, we will only have two sections because we have no closed meeting discussion scheduled. First is a work session to hear and discuss a report that does not require a council vote. That usually takes us up to around 5:30, though you don't have to feel as though you are obligated to fill that entire time if you don't want to. And then at 6:30, we will have a council business meeting. So our item for the 4 o'clock agenda is a report on the Regional Transit Governance Study that the TJPDC is doing. And we have, do we have folks by video? Okay, there's our video. Okay, there's Lucinda Shannon. And Dr. Stephanie Monin Yankson, is she with us also? How are we doing this?
I don't see her, but I can do the presentation if she doesn't come on.
Okay. Well, I'm happy to open the floor to Sandy, to you, or Lucinda, to you, whoever wants to take it and run.
I think Sandy's going to do an introduction and then Stephanie is on. So.
Okay.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all this afternoon. Thank you for having us, Mayor Snook, members of council, and Mr. Sanders. I've had the pleasure of working with most of you, but for those of you who don't know me, my name is Sandy Shackelford, and I'm the Director of Planning and Transportation for the Thomas Jefferson Planning District Commission. I also want to acknowledge that Lucinda Shannon, who is the TJPDC's project manager for this project, and Christine Jacobs, the TJPDC's executive director, joining us virtually, even though they were unable to be here in person. This afternoon, we will be discussing the Regional Transit Governance Study with you all. This governance study was initiated as a follow-up to the Regional Transit Vision Plan that the Thomas Jefferson Planning District Commission completed in late 2022. The Transit Vision Plan established a unified, long-term vision of transit service throughout the region. This governance study was initiated to support the achievement of the regional transit priorities identified in the Vision Plan by identifying governance options for regional transit and increasing transportation investments. The study is funded by the Department of Rail and Public Transportation, you all as the City of Charlottesville, Albemarle County, and the Thomas Jefferson Planning District Commission. We appreciate your financial support and engagement on this important topic. The work is being undertaken by a team of consultants from AECOM and Jarrett Walker and Associates, many of whom also worked to develop the Transit Vision Plan initially. So tonight, the presentation is going to be conducted by Dr. Stephanie Monin Yankson, who is the project manager from AECOM. Ms. Monin Yankson was the task lead for the Central Virginia Transportation Authority's Regional Transit Governance Study, and she has extensive experience conducting transit governance and funding studies. And with that, I will turn your attention over to Dr. Monin Yankson.
So how are we getting her in?
She should be able to present. She has a presentation ready.
Christine, Lucinda, do you either of you know what the story is? I see you're both visible at least.
No, it looks like she's on the Zoom call, but I'm not getting sound from her.
Well, I think Lucinda said that she could do it if she had to, so we want to go ahead.
Sure, I can start us off. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, sorry. I have to open the PowerPoint first, right? And then share it. So, the Regional Transit Governance Study, as Sandy said, is a follow-up to the Regional Transit Vision Plan. And the purpose of it is to find additional funding to enable us to enact the services that were part of the vision plan. The project team is on the TJPD side, myself, Christine, and Sandy. And then on the AECom side, Peter Voorhees, Stephanie Among in Yankston, and Scott Baker. Peter worked on the vision plan with us, and Stephanie worked on the governance study for Richmond's new transit authority, the Central Virginia Transit Authority, or Transportation Authority. So in this presentation, we're going to go over the study background and the goals and some preliminary outcomes that we have, and then the next steps, and then discussion. We had planned on presenting to you at the very end of the project and giving you recommendations. However, we're in the middle of the project, and this was the only time that we were able to get on your agenda. So we're gonna give you some of the outcomes and then talk about next steps that we will be taking. And we'll be talking with some of you more throughout this project. So the vision, transit vision plan, which is what started this off, created a clear long-term vision for efficient, equitable, and effective transit service for the region. We had extensive outreach with stakeholders and the community, and came up with 2 networks or service networks that would meet the goals and objectives of the community for public transit. And we had a constrained network and an unconstrained network. The unconstrained network was if money was no object. And this would it's based on the services that we already have. We worked with the transit providers to make the network, and so that it works with them, and it would have CAT's updated routes that they're planning on. It would have the buses running 7 days a week with much more frequency. A lot of them would be about 10 minutes between buses instead of half an hour and an hour. The constrained network would be similar, but it would have less less span between, so you might wait 20 minutes for the bus instead of 10 minutes. There would be not as many routes and less microtransit service. The unconstrained network has microtransit service in the rural urbanized areas, in the rural areas, and then it would have an hourly bus from the rural area to this urbanized area to Charlottesville. That would be every hour, and that would run 7 days a week. A lot of what we saw was people who live out in the rural area because housing's cheaper, but then they can't get to work and they're working a service job, and sometimes they get off before the bus, after the bus stops running. So this would address a lot of those needs. So the study goals are to identify strategies for dedicated transit funding to augment the current jurisdictional costs for transit. So we're looking at generating more revenue and then adding that dedicated for transit, and then identifying a governance structure that can manage and account for the additional transit funds. This would better capture and allocate the full costs of service and ensure transparency. The region, a regional transit authority or entity can serve as a funding agency to manage and provide accountability for any additional transit revenues generated. So we had a couple questions, and well, I guess we have time. I can go through these. So we wanted to look at how, yeah, okay.
Hi, Lucinda.
Yeah,
Sorry to interrupt you, but I had technical issues in the beginning with a Zoom link.
do you
Right.
want to go ahead and take over and I'll do the slides for you?
Yeah,
Okay. I have the old slides.
okay. I can go ahead and share my screen. Thank you.
Oh, okay. I'll stop sharing.
All right, and please for joining a few minutes late because I had issues with joining the Zoom link, but I'll go ahead and share screen now. But I'll do a brief introduction. My name is Stephanie Amwini Yangson. I'm with AECOM, the consultant supporting TJPDC on this study. And we thank you very much for your time, for giving us to listen to where we are. And we hope that this time will be a time of discussion and feedback to also get your impression on the study. As part of your agenda packet, we included an initial, a 4-page summary of the study. And so if you've had a chance to read it, it would have given you an overview of where we are currently. So,
Stephanie, I just finished the goals part.
okay. Thank you again, and I should be able to share screen now.
Sorry, I was muted. Does anyone have any questions while Stephanie's getting her presentation up?
Council, any questions? Okay. Brian and I have seen this, what, 2 or 3 times now?
Yeah. We should ask you.
No, that's why we got the experts here.
So why have you seen it 2 or 3 times?
MPO, Regional Transit Partnership.
Oh, okay, your committees.
Yeah.
Okay, can everyone see my screen?
We can see you, we can't see your screen. Okay, now we've got your screen. There we go.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. And thank you for bearing with me during this time. But I'll go ahead and continue, pick up from where you ended up. So Lucinda was able to go through the goals, the study goals with you all. And really, when we talk about a transit authority, what we are looking for is, one, to be able to find some options for dedicated transit revenue, and 2, to be able to get options of creating an entity, and this could be an authority that can govern that body, that can govern and manage that funding source. And so those are the 2 key things: identifying dedicated transit options, and then 2, what could be a potential structure for managing this funding source to achieve the objectives that we identified in the Transit Vision Plan. And so to achieve this, what we did was we are undertaking a 5-phase project. So the first part was looking at the existing conditions. We did some reviews of the current transit service. We spoke with John, with CAT, and even with UTS. We also spoke with some of the different, we had a group meeting, stakeholder meeting with representatives from the different jurisdictions. The second portion of this was doing a peer study, looking at peer regions. So regions across the country that also have a regional structure for transit. And what we did was we interviewed them and we asked them questions about what are their main funding sources, and also try to get strategies that we could implement here in the Charlottesville area, looking at what their governance structure also looks like. And Phase 3, which is what we are currently, the phase that we are in right now in the study, is looking at what are potential revenue sources, discussing them with stakeholders and evaluating them. So right now, we've gone through over the last few months, 2 to 3 months, we've been doing extensive stakeholder engagement. We've spoken with all the different localities, elected officials and staff members from the different localities. And this is our time to speak to you. But I think we also have something else scheduled at the end of the month. And so once we are through with this phase, we'll have a list of potential revenue sources, the potential yields, and a discussion of the feasibility of some of these sources. Once we are done with that, phase 4 now looks at what are different governance structures that we could propose to manage this funding, this potential funding. And what that would look like is who is going to participate in said regional entity, and what would that look like in terms of board representation and membership, et cetera. Once we are done with all of that, we'll summarize our recommendations and present them. And our final report is due in December as well. So this chart you're looking at here just shows you the stakeholder engagement that we've planned and already done and what we have in the future. Our steering committee has been representatives from the different jurisdictions. We have meetings with the RTP, which also includes the transit operators. We've had some one-on-one meetings with the localities and some presentations with the MPU and the TJPDC Commission as well to make sure that everyone is engaged on this. And so I'll go straight into our key findings right now for the governance portion. In looking at doing some research on what a potential entity could look like, in the Charlottesville region, there's already legislative provisions for an authority, and it's labeled as the Charlottesville-Albemarle Regional Transit Authority. Now, the essential boundaries of this authority are Charlottesville and all or portions of Albemarle County. Now, we know Albemarle County has some portions that may be very rural or may not be able to be included in this entity. And so it's the main portions, Charlottesville, Albemarle, with a provision for the other jurisdictions such as Fluvanna, Louisa, Greene, and Nelson to participate if they wish to. The main issue with this current funding is it has many of the authorities that we need for to run, but the main issue is that it doesn't make a provision for funding. And so with the lack of funding, there's really little that can be done in terms of pushing forward the transit objectives that we have for the region. So that's one of the first things. The second one is looking at our peer review, looking at the various agencies we interviewed and spoke with. There are different other governance structures that we could potentially look at. They don't all have to be the authority structure. So we saw in Blacksburg, it's similar to CAT, is a town department run by the locality, the local government, but majority of their funding comes from the university. In Bloomington, they have what is called a Public Transportation Corporation. Now, this is very similar to John's structure, which is also a public transportation corporation. However, in Bloomington, it's funded by property and income tax. That's how they fund their services. For CATA, it's a joint municipal authority, meaning that it's a joint agreement by the member jurisdictions, and how it's funded is through contributions that are agreed upon by the member municipalities. There's in the Ithaca area, they have their system is a 501c nonprofit. They are also funded through a combination of contributions from the city, from the county, and from the university. This is where Cornell University is located. And in Ann Arbor in Michigan, theirs is a typical transportation authority that has it has the powers to levy a tax. So it's funded by a local property tax. And so considering some of the strategies that they are implementing and what we see currently in the Virginia, in the Commonwealth that has been already done with some of the authorities we have, we came up with these 3 courses of action that we will proceed with. So the first option is either we establish a new authority, so something similar to CVTA or HR TAC. So that would be a new legislation with that is designed in a way that meets all the needs that we have, particularly with the option of providing that dedicated transit funding source. A second option is taking the existing CARTA legislation that we have, which is the Charlottesville-Albemarle Transit Authority. The benefit to that is it's already an existing authority, but it would have to have a few different amendments to allow it to have that funding source that we need. And the third is to determine some other framework. So we could look at what would a joint municipal agreement look like, or a JPA? What would it look like to have a different structure other than what we've looked at? And so these are some of the questions and discussions we'll be having in phase 4 to come up with those alternatives that can be discussed by the jurisdictions. Now, I'll say here that we understand that the Charlottesville region is very diverse. There's the heavily urbanized areas, but then there's also very rural areas. And there are options that exist to ensure that there's equitable distribution of the resources that are collected. We know that Charlottesville's priorities might be slightly different from, for example, Albemarle's priorities, or from Louisa County's priorities. And so through this discussion, this is where we can define who wants to participate, who is interested, and what would that look like in having that sort of entity. Now, that is for the governance portion. Now, moving on to the transit funding portion. Lucinda already did a great job at describing what the options that we are looking at for improved transit service is. She talked about the constrained and the unconstrained networks that we are looking at improving to different degrees. But I will say that both options, even the constrained option, has a significant improvement to the current service. And these 2 options require a substantial increase in the local revenue. Generally, transit is funded through a combination of federal, state, local, and internally generated. Now, internally generated funds represent any funding that is generated by the transit and authority or agency itself. So for example, in the case of CATS, that would be any contract revenues or revenues from fare revenues from selling fare passes, or which now we understand is not really a source, but that's what internally generated revenues, or even advertising, concessions, anything that is generated by the agency itself. The local revenue is the local portion that is used to match the state and the federal funds. We've been in a lot of discussion with DRPT. They are one of our core project study partners, and we've been discussing with them what these options would look like in terms of potential increases in state assistance if the service were to substantially increase. And they gave us some estimates as well that we've taken into consideration. However, in our analysis, we are assuming that the federal assistance will not significantly change because of the way it's distributed, not based on the amount of service, but by the population, and because of the formula is based on population. And so we also looked at other Commonwealth authorities that are used to fund transit to identify what are our options if we want to increase the local portion. The list you are looking at here is just a summary of some of the sources we identified from 3 entities: the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority, the Hampton Roads Accountability Commission, and the Central Virginia Transportation Authority. With HR Tech, we actually spoke to the director, Kevin Page as well, who gave us some really good insights. And so the list here from sales tax, grantors, field taxes, all the way to the interstate enhancement program are some of the sources of funding for these three large authorities we have in the state. Now, some of these are more feasible than others based on different criteria that we looked at, including the potential yield, the ease of implementation, what the potential public acceptability would be, and some even equity considerations. For example, in the case of the fuel tax, through extensive research and a lot of stakeholder engagement, we realized that it is not right now, it's not an impossible source, but it's still a likely source, but would require more to implement because of changes that happened in the legislature in 2020. The three entities I have listed here have a portion of the fuel taxes that goes to fund transit for them. But after that, it was made so that all other sales taxes directed to VDOT for the district grant program. And so that would have to be changed at a legislative level to make that source also available to Charlottesville. What you need to understand is that this additional or supplemental fuel tax is collected statewide. And so it is already collected in the Charlottesville area, but it's all directed toward the district grant program. And so some legislation would need to be changed or amended to allow it to fund transit. And similar with the recordation taxes as well. But in our interviews and our discussions, we came to the conclusion that some other options were more feasible than others. So we looked at a sales and use tax, a lodging tax or transient occupancy tax, property tax or real estate tax. The table you're looking at here is, it shows the initial cost estimates for the two networks that we are looking at. One is the constrained and the unconstrained. You should note that these costs do not include the cost for ADA, paratransit, or capital investments. But taking into account the potential funding we'll receive from the state and from the federal aid, there's still some portion that would have to be covered by local funding or some sort of internally generated funding. And this is between about $19,000 and $55,000. Again, the funding to be raised can also be anywhere in between, just depending on what kind of network we wish to build. And so we did some analyses on these potential estimates that can be, revenue that can be generated. The tables you are looking at here show the estimates for sales and use tax and property tax for Albemarle, Charlottesville, and then a combination of the rural counties, which would be Louisa, Greene, Fluvanna, and Nelson County. We also looked at a lodging tax and for real estate tax. For one of the rural jurisdictions, they don't have a lodging tax right now, so we used Louisa counties as a proxy. We also learned that in Charlottesville, there's already, you may already be at your peak in terms of, I think it's 8%, and it's the same for Albemarle. And so maybe some more work or implementation for that source would need some more, or would need some more direction from you and how to proceed. But looking at that, we see that on average, for just the sales and use tax alone, we could generate approximately $37 million per year for operating the transit service outside of capital. For the personal property, about $13 million, about $1 million for lodging tax, and for the real estate tax is the highest, about $260 the assumptions for the percentage increases are not set in stone. They were just used as a proxy to get the conversation started. So for all three, except for the sales tax, we estimated an additional 0.5%. And for the sales tax, 0.7%. But only because for the sales tax, we saw that in the other cases such as CVTA, HR tag, and MBTA, they all have a 0.7% sales tax addition. And so that was the basis for that assumption. And so looking at these two, we see that if we were to go with even only the sales and use tax, that gets us about halfway in our in the estimates for the two different types of networks, which is still a significant improvement to the current service level. Even if we were to meet just the constrained network, that was still a significant improvement. So even with going only the sales and use tax, that is something that we could pursue and discuss more in terms of what the potential feasibility would look like and what the appetite for the customers would be, or for the localities would be. Our next steps, I know that I've gone a little bit over time, but our next steps would be to, like I mentioned, go to phase 4, which is now discussing this a little bit more to reach some sort of consensus on governance structure. So here, by the end of that, we want to understand which localities would want to participate in such an entity. What would that look like? We want to make sure that there's as much transparency as possible to managing the added revenue. The additional benefit to having such an authority compared to the existing system we have is that the entity would better be able to allocate, first capture the full cost of providing service, and be able to allocate those costs better. So even if it's with contracting service to outer jurisdictions, you are better able to capture what the full costs are and allocate it in the most equitable way possible. But I would like to now turn it over to you all to discuss, to have just a brief time of discussion, depending on how much time you'll give us, on what are your thoughts for this study for transit service in the city of Charlottesville and in the region? What are your thoughts on potential barriers that you think need to be addressed before we can move forward? What are some concerns you may have about equity, whether it's for the city, it's on its own, or even for different groups of people in the region? And any other concerns you think that we need to address for you as a council to support the next steps for this study. So I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
And let me kick it off a little bit by saying that we have some additional time today. Ordinarily, we're looking at sort of a half hour, 45 minutes for a presentation, but you're the only thing on the agenda for the 4 o'clock meeting, and so we can go till 5:30 if we need to. The second thing I wanted to mention is that there are increasingly ominous weather reports coming, and I'm guessing as I'm looking at the weather.com maps and so on and what they're predicting, that somewhere around 5:15 to 5:30 we may suddenly have a storm upon us. If it's only rain, that's not a problem, we're indoors. If we lose power, obviously that poses some problems. My experience with power downtown has been that if it's not coming back on in a half an hour, it may be 4 hours or more. We're not in City Hall. City Hall has some preferences, but my law office is half a block away from here, and I can tell you that when we lose power, it's typically for either 15 minutes or 5 minutes or a whole lot longer than that. So my overall thought, and we've got folks, the city manager is in contact with emergency service people who can give us more accurate information. But if we lose power, we would hold on for a while and see how it all shakes out. With that in mind, councilors, questions about what we've just heard?
Yeah, I have some questions, comments, and these are just things that, I'm not expecting a response today, just to kind of give you something to think about, and that is, you know, the authority for some of those revenue sources, and I don't know them all, that if we have to get authority from the General Assembly, we found that has been an obstacle, so I think that can be anything that we have to, you know, go outside to get authority for, we can put that in a category of
Not now, certainly.
yes, yeah, it could
Highly
be,
unlikely at
yes.
this point in time.
yeah. Like to know I mean, this has been 15 years or so since I worked on these type of things in my role as a transportation planner for the county, but back in those days, whenever we will propose, because the state only has a set pool of money for transportation, and if someone else created authority or new transit system, that was great, but that means all the other localities got less money, and I just want to make sure how that fits into all this, and in particular if it's going to have any impact on Jaunt, because if it does, then it's likely they're going to be coming to the localities for funds to reach their service. I just want to know the impact on that, and I'm glad that you all have had discussions with them. I heard that, and for me, one of the bigger issue is just the whole authority thing, because as the speakers said, this is a very diverse community, and Charlottesville and Albemarle is really different from some of the rural counties that we have, and if, you know, we just need to make sure that, you know, everyone needs will be met, and no locality can prevent the experiment or the piloting or the expansion or reduction or whatever in somewhere else. But you know, it should be discussion, but it can't be like we don't want that city or that county or whatever to be able to do that without money type of thing. So that would definitely come up at some point in time, and I wasn't real clear on what that will look like with the proposal. Politics sometimes gets in the way of some good decisions sometimes. And I recall down in Richmond, this was way back, probably changed then, that I believe Chesterfield and Henrico kind of bought into the regional transit system to prevent it from coming into their locality. And I think that's opening up now. I know that there's a lot of expansion now, but that really hampered that growth for many years. So I just want to prevent all those things, or at least go into it knowing those things and try to address it the best we can. So those are the initial thoughts that I came up with. I may have some more, Mr. Mayor, as there's more discussion and some people may mention, but that's where I am now. So I know there's no answer to those now, but those will be some things that I will be thinking about as long, while I'm here on council, so.
We actually can respond to some of those,
No.
to some of that feedback at this point. And maybe, so I think I heard that you want there to be consideration, or there's concern that there's consideration that everybody who participates in that has their individual needs met through this process. That there is a question about what could potentially be the unintended circumstances on the transit agencies and the existing operators, and some questions about better understanding the authority for revenue sources and what kind of potential process we would need to go through with the General Assembly. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Would you like to take the first pass at that, Stephanie?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Thank you. So with looking at in the Commonwealth, what we understand is that for any taxes to be passed, they would still need at the state level approval. And so with the options we've looked at for the sales, the lodging, the real estate, and for the personal property, especially the sales tax would need the General Assembly approval. They would have to pass it at the state level because it would be collected at the state level and then brought back down. The lodging tax is going to be a local one, but still needs approval. And so it's generally the way in which it's these authorities or funding revenue sources are passed for transit at the state level is that any funding would need to go through the General Assembly, just period. And that's what we've seen from the other authorities we've looked at.
Yeah, just quickly, I can't get this to come back on. We tried to get it approved for, you know, babies, children in school, and we couldn't do it. So I think that this, I mean, maybe it was something against Charlottesville, so I just think that it's going to be, you know, an issue. But anyway, thank you.
Yes, it may, yeah, I think it could be challenging, but I think once we have strong support at whoever carries such a bill for the local levels, and we can get that support that Richmond was able to get, as long as we present the case for how beneficial that funding would be for the region. I think it can be done, especially because we already have that foundation of the Carter initial legislation as well.
I'll also reiterate, I'm imagining what Ms. Jacobs would say if she was here, but I also want to emphasize that we are aware that there are some challenging political dynamics in place, and we want to make sure that we are being thoughtful about how and when to proceed with any of these next steps. And so this is not necessarily something that we anticipate is going to move forward quickly, but we want to make sure that we are moving it forward, that we are progressing our goals through this process and being thoughtful about what those next steps look like and being ready to take advantage when the environment makes sense for us to potentially be successful.
I get more thoughts than questions, but I guess as best I could understand it, like we all know we want and need to move towards a bus system that has more frequent routes, is more reliable. The only way we're going to do that is with a regional transit authority that's bringing together CAT, Albemarle, Jaunt, UVA. So I'm 100% on board in that we as Charlottesville need to be on board and support this. Then the challenge of how do you fund it? It sounds like we can create a regional transit authority, but we just don't have authorization to fund it. And I think with the sales tax saga for schools, I think that whole time we had a split General Assembly of one House Republican, one Democratic. So just speaking for myself individually, I think depending on the outcome of this upcoming election, I could see it being something that could be very feasible in the next couple years. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering, what kind of timeline would you be thinking of in terms of having like Charlottesville and Albemarle have a unified approach in terms of our legislative packet, preparing our representatives, you know, ahead of the General Assembly session, that this is a top priority? Like, is there a sense of what kind of timeline we would start to do that on?
I don't know that we have a specific timeline. I think we want to make sure that no matter what we're doing, though, we are consistently taking steps to be moving towards those goals. So like I said, we want to be aware of what the political sort of feasibility and viability of this is going to be, so that we are aware that when the time is right, we are already positioned well. So part of what's going to happen when we wrap up this study is that we are going to be thinking about what is the next step. We already have the authority to operate a Charlottesville, Albemarle Regional Transit Authority. So what might that look like? What are some interim things we can do to start building sort of the legitimacy of that authority, so that we can start building buy-in and start building consensus and just being prepared when the environment is favorable for us to move forward with some of these goals.
Yeah, and you talked through some of the pros and cons of different funding mechanisms. When it comes to the fuel tax, is that one that seems, you know, a step beyond, even harder than the General Assembly authorizing, say, like a new sales tax that would just go to just a transit authority? Like, because I wasn't clear on how hard of a lift that is.
So potentially, because before 2020, when CVTA, which theirs happened in 2020, but CVTA, CHARTAC, MVTA that have the option for the sales tax, that option was provided before the omnibus bill that changed the way fuel taxes are allocated throughout the state. So what it did was This supplemental tax was now spread throughout the state. So now it's collected everywhere, not only in those regions, but then for everywhere that is not stated specifically in the legislation, it's their funding goes straight to the district grant program to fund transportation throughout the state. And so technically, if Charlottesville were to get a portion of that money back, or even the portion generated within the Charlottesville region, it would technically reduce the overall pool, but it does not mean, I don't see that as being unfair, or it would make it more difficult because it means it's a smaller pool for the district grant program, but a case can still be made. But that's just to say it's not as impossible as another source such as the recordation tax, which is really just a $20 million line that was just taken off the top of all the taxes collected throughout the state and handed over to HR TAC. It's very different. That is almost impossible to do now because even as we spoke to Laura Fama, who is from VDOT, she mentioned how there's been various bills that have been presented at the state level to try to repeal that $20 million that they received, but it didn't pass. So that's going to be much more harder. So those are some of the things that we can consider. They also think that, yes, the fuel tax is probably less likely source just because it's funding this overall statewide program.
Okay. Well, yeah, that's pretty much it. But again, I'm 100% on board, and that I think the city needs to be going all in to figure out, how do we get to a regional transit authority and work with Albemarle and whatever partners are willing to join us and think, what can we do now to, because I think in a couple of years we probably can win some sort of funding mechanism, and obviously we won't even get to the constrained vision unless we do that. So,
Could I follow up on some of Michael's questions? Because I'm curious, if we were permitted to do something with the gas tax, because I got this sort of fixed in my mind because I think that do I understand that there are some places that do fund their transit authorities with fuel tax surcharge? How much, let's say in the Charlottesville Albemarle area, if we were able to tack on another 1 cent for a local something or other, how much money are we talking about?
We haven't done that analysis yet, so we'd
Okay.
have to look into what an increase in the local gas tax would look like. We didn't include it in our initial estimate just because, like we mentioned before, we wanted to look at what are the potential sources that could be more feasible.
Well, I mean, it would seem to me that if somebody, surely there is some database someplace where you click on a number and it pops up with the number of gallons of gas sold in Charlottesville and Albemarle, and you can quickly figure that out. I'm just curious, and it may be simply a matter of trying to understand history as opposed to something we could move forward with. On the other hand, there are a lot of things that didn't seem possible until somebody did them. One of them was the notion of taking all of the recordation taxes and sending them to Hampton Roads. I mean, nobody would have thought of that until somebody from Hampton Roads with sufficient either gumption or I don't know, some other less charitable way to characterize it, made it happen. So I'd be curious to know what some of these possibilities are. The other thing that struck me, I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, so what that would entail is we would have to reach out to the Department of Taxation to try to get some yields from what it looks like from the city of Charlottesville and some of the other jurisdictions in terms of yields from the gas taxes.
Well, I mean, frankly, what I'm thinking of is, 3 phone calls and somebody sends you an Excel spreadsheet. I'm not thinking that, I'm saying you've got to spend 5 hours on this. But I would just be curious.
Lucinda actually did some research on this a couple years ago.
I did that, just kind of napkin math a couple of years ago, and it was, the gas tax was a small amount compared to the sales tax.
Okay.
And I don't remember the numbers, but it was definitely like a quarter or a third of like what we could get if we did the sales tax.
Okay.
So also the gas tax eventually with fuel efficiency and electric cars coming up is going to be reducing and getting smaller too. So that wasn't something that we thought we should focus on. But we can look into it more if you think we should.
Well, like I said, I'm really thinking about a half an hour tops. The other thing I wanted to mention is that you had put up there a figure for raising the real estate tax, and you had this nice benign-looking 0.5% until you realized that right now our taxes, our real estate taxes, are 0.96%, and that a 0.5% increase is actually a more than 50% increase in the taxes that fund virtually everything that we do. And that just strikes me as being not anywhere near in the cards.
Yeah, so that, the way we have it in our, again, it's a simple spreadsheet that we can adjust the percentages. But that was just a conversation starter to look at if 0.5 is, that's too huge. What is acceptable? Is it maybe 0.1, a quarter, 0.025? Like, what would that look like? And that's what we need the feedback and the discussion from.
Well, to me, it's not a conversation starter, it's a conversation ender.
So,
Anyway, other council.
yeah, thank you for the presentation. A couple of things, just trying to sort out. So if I go, well, it's page, I guess, 4 of our packet, where you list the 3 options of what you could do with the current, I guess we'll call it CARTA, the Charlottesville-Albemarle Regional Transit Authority. So as I understand it, we have a CARTA, we can do a lot of things with it, except raise money as an entity, is that right? That's what you're telling me?
Correct, yes.
That's
It has-
correct?
Yes, that's
Okay.
it's, the provision is there in the legislation, but it hasn't been activated.
Well, so,
But there is no funding, it doesn't include a way to fund said entity.
well, does it specifically exclude, I haven't read it, I've seen it at one point. Does it specifically exclude the possibility of raising money as part of the CARTA?
No, it does not exclude it.
So why
but
would we have
it's
to go
not-
back to the, I'm just wondering why we'd have to go back to the General Assembly.
Because for, the legislation needs to specifically give authority and state what kind of tax it is, how much it will be raised.
And that's a legal,
Where?
that's something that's cast in
For
stone,
the
isn't it?
Commonwealth, correct, yes.
Bill and rule.
At the local level, it cannot be done.
Okay, so then the next question I have, going back to the taxes, which we're not supposed to talk about, but going back to the list of taxes that you had on that, say we come up with some random smattering of those. The one thing that was not included that I could see was any sort of contribution by the university. So the university would be one funding stream that would need to be layered into this. But what if we came up with a quasi-authority, and I'm just spitballing here, where we said Charlottesville, Albemarle, the university, so that's a QARTA, anyway. We all sign a memorandum of understanding, say we want to have the constrained network, this is what it will take to fund it. We get, signatures and agreements, and then we just go do it. We figure out, how much money we'll need from the city, how much money we need from the county, how much money we need from the university, and take this in a sort of, this is our first step, and then we prove that this works, and then on a parallel path, we go talk with the General Assembly and try to get, to get it where we've got sort of centralized funding authority. But is there not a way we could sort of bootstrap this thing with some MOUs and goodwill?
Exactly. So I was actually internally discussing the potential for a joint venture agreement that wouldn't require any legislative action, but would be an agreement between the municipalities on how they would fund it, and it would be funded, like you said, from contributions by the members. We've done some discussion with the university at the beginning, and we actually haven't talked about the option of Charlottesville, Albemarle, and just the university. So thank you for that. We talked about Charlottesville potentially doing more on the university property, on the university grounds. And we looked at the contributions from the university. Right now, it's about, I believe about 350,000 per year, and about 250 or so for Johns, and about 350 for Catch right now. And so that is not a significant amount. But then if it is feasible, the appetite is there with the university, we could open up this discussion of potentially increasing what those contributions would look like. So we can talk a lot more about that. So thank you for that option of like Charlottesville, Albemarle, and the university. We'll look into that more. But yes, a JPA or a joint venture agreement as a first step where you contribute and then try to implement some transit improvements in the short term while we wait on what the legislature could look like and in some time in the future.
And if you go back to your, I'm sorry to interrupt, if you go back to the spreadsheet where you had sort of the cost for the, let's just assume we go with constrained, because that is all that's reasonable to expect right now.
Yeah.
And you deduct the federal and the state. What
Yes.
was the number that you came up with at the bottom? 13 million?
No, it's about 19.
Okay, 19 million. So to me, that then becomes a question of, people's priorities in terms of, what they want to spend money, their local tax dollars on. It becomes a budget issue. Maybe there's a certain designation we make, or,
I think it still comes down to priority, but I still don't see how, thinking a couple years from now, it's impossible to envision we could be granted authority by the General Assembly for transit authority to raise funds. And one way that could be defined is a sales tax that goes directly to transportation. I think a 1 cent in both Charlottesville and Albemarle would be more than enough to cover that cost. And I don't see that as either fiscally or politically impossible if there is agreement that, having a much more robust public transit system is a top priority. So I just don't see how that is something that we should politically be writing off or thinking isn't possible.
yeah, I don't think it's impossible. I'm just thinking about a tiered approach.
Sure.
Maybe we assume 5 years from now that the stars will align, and in the meantime, we start working towards that with this JVA or whatever.
Sure. Well, and I think, this upcoming election, quite frankly, could impact the timeline a lot.
That's all my
Yeah.
questions. Thank you.
Yes, and I wanted us to talk a little bit more about some of the questions you raised, the other ones. You talked about the impact on Johns, the impact on the other localities on their transportation funds as well. So for example, with the impact on Johns, if we were to go with the idea of a joint venture agreement, we would want to, what are your thoughts of bringing Johns also as part of that agreement as one of the operators in the region, if we want to have them on board for how services are run in the region, if we wanted to open it up to not only Charlottesville, Albemarle, the university, but even include some of the rural areas, what would be your thoughts on that, and your thoughts on including Johns, since a CAT would be already included in a way, since it's a town department? Remember, there's 2 steps to this. There's looking at it as the authority as a funding agency, or looking at how the operations are also provided currently. So right now, if what we are thinking of is a funded entity that is able to manage where or what the fund should be used for, with the operating agencies providing, if we were to look at the CVTA model where GRTC provides a plan, a detailed plan on what they are going to use the funding for, and the monitoring mechanisms are in place to ensure that they actually use the funding for what the regional plan is, we could do something like that for the Charlottesville region as well, because we have this system where we have the separate operators. That's something we also need to think about. But
So-
any thoughts on that?
So, yeah, I think that definitely Jaunt needs to be part of that discussion, because right now they are essentially the public transportation system in the rural areas. And they have a high level of trust with some of the boards of supervisors, and certainly the public and the nonprofits in the community. So I just think that they need to probably be a bigger part of the discussion now, instead of looping them in on the end. You know, that would be my suggestion.
Thank you.
Well, yeah, I think ideally you would want something where Albemarle, CAT, UVA, and Jaunt are all together. Just, that would seem to me the most strategic way to combine resources, but I don't know.
And so one of the questions that I was getting at about, you know, the dynamics of this community is like, what if we wanted to provide, you know, increased frequency of service for the entire region, but only 1 or 2 localities decide to increase their sales tax or whatever for it. And those are the type of things that, you know, I think that we just need to kind of think through in anticipation for, you know, those obstacles. Even though we can say, okay, I think things will be fine in the future, it's better to kind of plan for them now, so if it does happen, we have a game plan in place to say, well, this is what happens if A and B, you know, doesn't. So I know we can't consider every possibility, but the big ones we should try to figure out now.
Yes, I think if we look at the estimates from the sales tax, looking at just Albemarle and Charlottesville combined, together is about 26 million, just an estimate, and that is enough to fund the operation portions for the constrained network. And so even if we had a situation where the rural jurisdictions were not interested in participating, or it differed so much that we can't have a blanket tax or a blanket authority, it could still be Albemarle and Charlottesville carrying the authority, and then offering purchase service contracts to the rural localities where they pay the full cost of providing those services in their jurisdictions, if something like that were to come. So there's still that option of if they don't feel they're not ready to participate, they could still purchase service in some way if John's was to become part of as the operator, as a service provider, sorry. The only thing is now we are going to better be able to allocate what those full costs are. And whoever wants to purchase that service will pay the full cost of the service.
Thank you.
One thought that I had that sort of concerns me, and figure out whether we can figure out a way to do this. I'm thinking of folks in, let's say, Louisa County and Fluvanna County, for whom the Zion's Crossroads area is the easiest link to Charlottesville. But taking Louisa as an example, I suspect that people who live in the eastern part of Louisa County, say in Mineral, may be more interested in getting to Richmond than they are in getting to Charlottesville. Is there some way that we could say, if we were to try to make things of interest to the people in those rural jurisdictions, to say, we recognize that part of your jurisdiction may have no interest whatsoever in what we're talking about, but could we say, suggest something where, just, let's say we're using the sales tax as our main way of getting additional funds, to say, Louisa, supposing you all impose the same, or Louisa Fluvanna, that you impose the same percentage increase in your Zion Crossroads shopping centers as Charlottesville and Albemarle will be doing jurisdiction-wide. Is that the sort of thing that's ever been done in Virginia?
I'm not sure the answer to that question, so I'd have to get back to you on that.
Because I know that just from the conversations we've had on the Regional Transit Partnership, that some of the rural jurisdictions are really sitting there saying, why do we want to put in that kind of money into something that may benefit only some of our people, but not very many of them? And maybe, but what it does for us, of course, what we're seeing in Charlottesville is that increasingly our idea of a bedroom community to Charlottesville is Zion's Crossroads, it's Louisa County, it's areas that are not within Charlottesville and Albemarle. We've made specific arrangements in Buckingham and Waynesboro and so on. And one of the things that we had talked about in some of these other regional options was having a greater link between whatever is happening internal to Louisa County and coming into Charlottesville. And so if we're looking at Charlottesville's long-term development as a less car-dependent place, it would obviously be beneficial to us to have as many different ways for folks to get into Charlottesville on buses or some other alternative mode of transportation. And if we end up with a system that is simply not feasible, both politically and, I mean, just given the way that those outlying jurisdictions are going to see the situation, I'd really like to figure out if there's a way that we could be attractive to at least part of Louisa County,
Yes.
at least part of Fluvanna County.
I think and I'm not saying this with 100% certainty, but I think there should be a way of having parts of a county, just because for the Carter legislation, like I said, it makes allowance for all or parts of Albemarle County. And so the assumption being that if another county were to want to participate, that should also be an option to have all or parts of that county participate. And I think we would have to discuss what that would look like and what that means in terms of how it's divided up. But thank you for that suggestion, and I think we can bring that up when we have further discussions with Louisa.
Other counselors have questions? Ms. Puryear, you've been relatively silent. Any thoughts?
I've heard what all of you have said around the table, and one of the things that I'm hearing that you're going to go back and talk to the other regional municipalities, because there are a lot of people that rely on Jaunt, both in Charlottesville and Albemarle, but in outlying counties. And whatever we do, we don't want to make it cost prohibitive for people that rely on that service. When we're looking at taxes, and you're talking about fuel taxes, all of us buy fuel, but as you say, more people may ultimately have electric cars. But for people that rely on fuel, we want the tax to be something that is affordable regardless of your socioeconomic status. We've got to stay away from that property tax business. That's an accident waiting to happen. But I recently have seen the little, I think it's called the Afton Connector or the Afton Express. I think that's another way of having people come across the mountain, because if I am not mistaken, Charlottesville is one of the largest employers in Central Virginia, so, because of the University of Virginia. So I agree with Mr. Pinkston. UVA is gonna have to factor into this, venture in some shape, form, or fashion. And I think that's imperative, because their employees use our services. And if you remember the experiment or the ability for people at UVA to catch the trolley to come downtown to Charlottesville for various and sundry things at no cost to them was a benefit, and a lot of people utilize that service. So we just want to make sure that in us being fair and equitable, that we don't exclude anyone.
Thank you very much for that comment. I think in the peer study we looked at, we saw university participation to a very large extent, with some of them providing as much as their contributions being as much as $1 million for their calendar year. And so, but that also meant that the operators provided more service on campus and not only in the locality or in the city. And so with UVA operations and UTS operations and CAT operations, I think that's some other point that we have to discuss a little bit more. I do have another question on the sources that we've talked about. So we mentioned the property tax we said is not a good option, but what are your thoughts on the lodging or the real estate taxes as well? We've talked a lot about the sales tax, but what about the lodging or the transient occupancy tax right now?
Well, at least this, I'll speak for myself, we distinguish between property tax and real estate tax. I mean, I agree, 0.5%, or I'm not quite sure I track the percentage, but if it's 50
5%.
cents as opposed to what we're at now, 96,
Right.
that would not be realistic. But it might be realistic to raise some money from real estate revenues if we had to. So I don't, this one, I don't know about other people, but I don't want to take that source of revenue
No.
completely off the table.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm,
Clearly, we wouldn't want to raise $236 million
Yeah.
or whatever the number, but I think we could do some. So anyway, I see it as a mix of funding that we're going to have to come up with. And I would say it's all, we face these questions every year when we're in the budget season about what's the appropriate amount of money to ask from a certain source of revenue. So at some level, this would become a conversation with our staff about, a budget question.
Yeah. And as far as the lodging tax, I think that, as I said on the tourism committee board, I know that we're woefully understaffed to comparable city like Asheville and places like that. It has a much bigger budget and staff that we just need to look at that if that's, because right now their budget is based on the lodging tax that they get from rooms or something like that. So we just have to, it's all kind of tied together. We just need to look at the impact of one, and the room, as we discuss, it's going to have to get bigger as we discuss the impact of the funding. So.
and likewise, I think all of them, in my mind, are on the table as potentially being part of some kind of mix of funding it. I would definitely agree with others. If you're talking about solely funding it with lodging or real estate, then that's very likely a non-starter and doesn't make sense. But I think there's a way to do it that will not have too many negative impacts. And I mean, it's a big new expense. It will transform our bus system, having 15, 20-minute routes that go further. And there's no way to do that without some trade-offs. But I think we can find the trade-offs that are worth it. So I haven't, none of them are like completely, we can't even discuss it for me.
Correct.
Okay.
Have to spread the wealth around.
Any other comments, counselors? Or if any city manager or anybody else?
I did just have, Christine, I just want to know, we are also doing the long-range strategic plan, is that?
Well, there's the transit strategic plan and there's the long-range transportation plan. The-
Which one am I?
Yes.
The lo-
Answer the
your
question.
Your stakeholder on the long-range
That's right,
transportation
okay,
plan.
yeah, so, and, is that tied in, I mean, that's factoring in, because we talk about unconstrained and constrained plan with that as well, but it's looking at road improvements as, as well as transit and bicycle, pedestrian, and things like that as well.
Yeah, it maybe is not directly connected, but just to give a very high level, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about the long-range transportation plan while I'm here tonight. Some of the transit vision plan and the constrained and unconstrained network are really focusing on the services of the transit system. That said, there are some assumptions about needed transportation infrastructure improvements that might be needed to in order to support some of the services, specifically when you're talking about things like bus rapid transit. So the long-range transportation plan is really focusing on the capital infrastructure aspect, not the capital, but the infrastructure improvements. And so there are some relationships between them, but they're kind of focusing on different aspects of service delivery.
Thank you.
Yep.
And I guess I will wrap it up by just simply saying that we've had a lot of internal conversation already. The team at CAT is involved in this conversation. I've met with Christine a few times to stay up on what's going on with this study and what the next steps will look like, in addition to having maintained ongoing conversations with the county. As you know, we're working with them on the microtransit pilot, so that has allowed us to really get a good understanding of what their priorities are for transportation. I'll just echo that I heard what you all said, in that you are willing to be disciplined in this process, because there will be trade-offs. It's a very expensive proposition to be able to do this. It will require regionalism at its best, I would imagine, to pull this off. And I do like the idea that you have already started to think about a plan B should we not be able to get all members of the region to participate, that we could also have a plan B, possibly a C version, and get somewhere in the way of being able to provide reliable service to those that we know most specifically need it in order to thrive, but then others who can then opt to use that service just as well.
Anything else?
Thank you very much.
Council, anything else from our end? We've been at, Mr. Chambers, you got anything for us?
I'm a spectator. He's the mastermind for us.
Gotcha. Okay, well, anything else from our distinguished panelists there? All right,
No,
well, thank you so
Just a
much.
thank you for the time tonight and for your engagement with us as a partner in this work. It's just so critical, and we really appreciate y'all.
Absolutely. We appreciate the work that is being done and will continue to be done. This has been an important priority for a number of us on council for the last 3 or 4 years, and hope we can move the ball forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
And with that, council, I don't know that we've got anything else on our agenda for the moment, and we don't even have a closed meeting to have to go into, so we don't need to have anybody read us into closed meeting.
Oh,
We-
Brian.
We
Oh,
just-
my God.
We will recess until 6:30, and we'll come back at 6:30 for the regular business meeting at that point. Anybody following on Zoom, I suspect it's a different Zoom link, so you're gonna have to start from scratch again. So, talk to people again at 6:30. Thank you all.